And John, I can share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me well. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ron Milo. If I can just get my right screen up here, sorry about all of this. So I should introduce this by saying the highest award of the Carl Woese Institute of Biology at Illinois is that of Pioneer in Genomic Biology. Today, Ron Milo, a holder of the Charles and Louise Gartner Professional Chair in the Department of Plant and Environmental Sciences of the Weizmann Institute, receives this award. Ron, this will be a framed picture that we will send to you, and you will also be on the wall of our lecture theatre as one of the holders of the Pioneer in Genomic Biology. This is for your groundbreaking work in analysing complex biological networks, particularly towards dynamic proteomics, and also in synthetic molecular biology. So about Ron, at the age of 16, Ron won first place in the National Physics Olympiad, and that was the start of a string of prestigious awards, including the Kennedy Prize and the General Electric Prize for Young Life Scientists. Ron's bachelor's was in physics and math, won with distinction, his master's in electrical engineering, and PhD in biological physics, followed by a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. Appointed to the Weizmann in 2008, Ron turned his hand to synthetic biology, including artificial photosynthetic pathways in biological organisms. Ron pioneered quantification of a wide range of biological processes and is famous for his cell biology by numbers, and increasingly his use of big data to address big problems. He has an exceptional skill in distilling massive data sets into clear, simple, yet highly novel and insightful messages. To show his breadth here, his most recent paper in eLife used the international data sets on COVID-19 to increase accuracy on the periods of infectiousness, so informing policy. Relevant to today's seminar is that last year, his group was the first to accurately quantify that human-made materials now outweigh Earth's entire biomass, and also the rapidity with which this overtaking has occurred. So these novel analyses, to quote, are not simply of comparing apples to oranges, but apples to cell phones. It brought into focus the multifaceted, growing impact of human activity on our planet and its workings. Ron is now going to tell us about the biomass distribution on Earth. So if I just switch the sharing, Ron, so that you can
Yes, I hope that you can see my screen now. Thank you for this very kind introduction. I should have invited my parents to also hear it, but maybe in the recording, I'll send them the recording. So thank you so much for that. So I'll be sharing with you the work of my lab, looking at the biomass distribution on Earth and the effects of humanity on it. I would say that, if anybody wants to open the camera, you're more than welcome to do that. It gives me some familiarity with some of the people, even though I didn't have the opportunity to come to Illinois. I hope that would also happen sometime soon. And so before the talk ends, I hope that you can answer some questions that we were very curious about and we thought are kind of like fundamental to know. And that is, what weighs the most on planet Earth? Is it mostly more bacteria, or more plants, more animals, or more fungi? Is life more abundant on land or in the oceans? What is the impact of humanity on the biosphere? And for all of those questions, we'd also like to get a quantitative perspective. So it's not only a question of this or that, but we'd like to know by how much, because that gives you sort of like a sixth sense in order to understand things more deeply. And the real hero behind the work I'll be presenting is this guy, Yinon Bar-On. He's a fantastic PhD student in the lab. And without his depth of understanding and breadth of knowledge, what I'll be showing you, I think, would not be possible. And so what kind of distribution we'll be looking at? So on the left, you can see things that relate to species richness, which is something that, for many years, many decades have been looked at and gave us all sorts of insights on evolution and other things. So that's definitely very important and useful. But we decided to take a different view, to look at mass as a metric of evaluation. And I'll touch upon later on, some of the features that I think make it especially useful and interesting. And if anybody wants, in every paper, we also have like this long supplementary material. You can also see the number of individuals as a metric. So speaking of, quantifying things, we need to know what are the units we'll be working with. And we're working with units of gigaton of carbon. So carbon is pretty useful and relevant because it's, affecting the climate as well as a normal measure in ecology. A giga is just 10 to the 9, and gigatons of carbon you can think about as kind of like a, big boxes of a kilometer by kilometer by kilometer in terms of just filled with mass. Obviously, it depends on the density, etc. But this could give you some sort of perspective. One benefit of these things is that it's independent when you weigh living things in that way. It's independent of the water content, so it doesn't matter if it rained last night or not. It's widely used and it's important for biogeochemistry. And so let me give you a concrete example, because that almost always helps understand what we're talking about. So if we're looking, for example, at the mass of humanity, so we could talk about an average person that weighs about 50 kilograms. Usually when I give this talk, there's some sort of like smiles about this 50 kilograms. So it's not because we're taking these extreme diets, but because we're looking over across all of humanity. So if you take both adults and children, this is the average weight. Out of that, about 70% is water and half is carbon. So you're left with about 10 kilograms of carbon per person. If you multiply that by the number of people in the world, you get about 10 to the 14 grams, or about 0.1 gigaton of carbon, which means that actually, if you wanted, you could maybe try and stuff all of humanity into this big cube of 1 kilometer on 1 kilometer on 1 kilometer. But that's not a very nice thing to entertain in your mind, but at least it gives you a perspective on what are the units we're talking about. So after all that, you might say to yourself, hey, this is not so complicated. Probably many of my high school friends could have done that calculation themselves pretty easily. The thing is, for almost anything else, it's not so easy to do. So if we take, for example, the mass of insects, something that we actually care about given the insect catastrophe or apocalypse that is upon us, and if anybody's interested, you could read about it. So we need to know, to do such a calculation, what is like the average weight or the number of individuals, but we don't know either of them for insects, not the number of them and not the average when they vary over, many orders of magnitude. So what can you do? Let me walk you through the way to approach such questions. And let me tell you, this is the toughest slide in the whole presentation. So if you bear with me and we pass this, from here onward, it would be much simpler. So let's say you want to know the mass of all the fish in the ocean, okay? So we don't have the budget or the ethical license to go and fish all the fish in the ocean, but we could find fish the literature. And when we do that, we could see all the different locations that, say, a specific taxa or all the fish or something have been measured in different locations in the oceans at a given specific time of the year. And now, if still it doesn't give you information about, you know, many other locations where you didn't have vessels going there and doing those measurements, or at different times of the year or different depths. And so the question is, what do you do about how do you get all the other values, how to estimate them? And the way to do that is to try and use all sorts of environmental parameters that might be of importance. So we will be testing many variables, looking for correlation. So it could be, for example, the temperature at that location, the kind of biome, the level of primary productivity, the depth of the ocean, the distance from the closest shore, anything you can think about. When you find such parameters, and it could be several parameters in parallel that have a strong correlation, will give you some functional relationship, then you're in a pretty interesting position, because now you can take that, and those environmental parameters, they're known globally, because those environmental parameters have been measured, I don't know, from space or by NASA, by any other measure. And now you can combine that together with this mathematical relationship that you found and extrapolate for all the different other locations in terms of, say, the mass of fish or something else. And then the last thing you need to do is just to integrate over the globe, and you have your global estimate. What do you do next? You actually repeat all of this exercise once again, but just with other environmental parameters. And then once again, because it's as important in science in general, and definitely for us, not only to get a number, but also to get some understanding of what's the uncertainty involved in that. So we want to know the range of how accurate do we know this number. Good. So if you follow this approach, now we could start and look at the results. So let me start with a question. Which taxon dominates the world biomass? And we're talking by mass. And I'll be happy if anybody is willing to put a bet in the chat, whether you think it's A, bacteria, B, fungi, C, plants, or D, protists. So would it be A, B, C, or D? And if anybody would be writing in the chat, I'll be happy to see. I usually ask for a vote when we're doing it face to face. Now I have to count on your, okay, so let's see, I'll be starting to read it from the top. So we have bacteria, protists, plants, fungi, protists, plants. Okay, so we see lots of bacteria. Okay, so we see, first of all, just, it's interesting, there's no, I don't see a consensus here, right? Even though I know I have a very intelligent, well-informed, well-read audience in front of me, still this question that is kind of, at least easy to ask, we don't seem to have a consensus. But this is actually something that I see again and again. So let's see the results. So the vast majority is really plants, about 90%. Bacteria, which are of course very important, they're about 5%. They're the next leading, so you can see it here. So we have about 450 gigatons of carbon in plants, and then followed by bacteria and then fungi. And so I think that's an interesting thing to know about the world. And I know many in your institute are studying plants, so I think that should give you special happiness. I see a smile. And so you might tell me, hey, this, I don't know protists, and this was a tricky question. So let's bring it closer to us. Let's talk about animals, right? Animals is something we usually have a more intimate knowledge of. So let's try and do a similar vote. In Israel, we have a lot of votes all the time. So we're just having a vote soon. So you could try and put your vote as well. What would you say is the animal taxon that has the most mass, weighs the most globally? Is it, so put again in the chat, is it arthropods, A, B, livestock, C, fish, or D, nematodes? Okay, I see again that we have quite a lot of variation here. So reading it quickly, I see Where did it start? Wow, you're very, you're fast at typing. So I see livestock, arthropods, ants, which are a type of arthropods, fish, nematodes, fish, livestock, fish, arthropods. Okay, so we're all over the place once again. Okay, it's good. We believe in diversity, so we have a diversity of views here. If you want to see the results, so here they are. So indeed, arthropods and fish are the most dominant ones. Actually, the difference is such, the uncertainty, we could see it later, is such that it's actually hard to make sure. But definitely anybody who voted for arthropods, well done. Although I have to say, it's not the ants that somebody was mentioning. In general, it's actually not insects. In general, the insects are really a small fraction here. The biggest contributor are actually these tiny crustaceans called copepods. I never heard about them before I started this study at all, and yet they're the most, the biggest contributor in terms of animal mass on the planet. And all those who voted for fish, it turns out about 90% of the mass of fish is actually mesopelagic fish, which are these tiny fish, which again, I never heard about before I started this. And actually, it turns out humanity did not know about them until the Second World War. During the Second World War, the British were trying to find a way to locate the German submarines. And for that, you might know they developed the sonar, and the engineers were working day and night. And then when they finished developing it, they started testing it. And then it turned out that they had the bottom of the ocean going up and down every day. So clearly they went back to the engineers. They told them there's like some bug in the design. They tried it again, and then they came and tested it again. The same thing. It turned out it wasn't a bug, it was a fish. And that fish are these mesopelagic fish which live in huge swarms, and they basically hide deep in the water at the depth of about 1 kilometer during the day. At nighttime, they climb up. I don't know, it's like the Eiffel Tower or 2 times the Eiffel Tower to the top of the water column. They eat like crazy during the night when they're less worried about predators. What are they eating, you might be asking yourself? Anybody wants to guess in the chat? So they're eating the copepods. Well done, Ed. So they're coming and they're eating all sorts of stuff, but a lot of it is actually what Ed was saying. They're eating copepods. And then before sunrise, they're going down 1,000 meters and they're hiding in the depth. Again, not wanting to be seen by predators. So if you voted for fish because you knew about the mesopelagic fish, really well done. And this is still, just to put it in context, this is less than 0.5%. Animals altogether are less than 0.5% of the biomass on Earth. So at least for me, this sort of gives some perspective on the different things. If you're interested, you could see in our paper the uncertainty on each of those variables. If you're interested in the slides, just email me. I'll send you a link to all the slides. I'm curious about this also. I'm interested in this not only for research, but also in terms of education, because I think that that's also part of an important role that we have to play. And I find that visualization helped me remember things, so we're working on that. But actually, in this case, when the paper came out, people did better visualization than us. So just if you won't remember anything from what I said, I hope this picture would like etch in your memory. So if you look at the top left at the picture of the person, and in size, in terms of perspective, you can see viruses, and then worms, which are these nematodes, the fish, all the vertebrates, and they, to put in proportion, is really these tiny things that you see here versus the fungi, the bacteria, and the plants. So from this, you can get one kind of picture. Another question that we were curious about is about where is biomass concentrated. So let me give you just 3 options, and you know the drill, so you can just write in the chat. whether you think just roughly it's 100 times more biomass in the oceans, roughly the same between oceans and terrestrial and on land, or C, 100 times more on land than in the ocean. So let's get some answers. So I have B, B, so like roughly the same, and then more on land, then again more on land, roughly the same, more on land, roughly the same, more on land. Okay, so maybe I'll show, now I have somebody in the oceans. Okay, so again, we see a diversity of views, which is kind of interesting because actually I gave you the answer just now. So really it is about 80 times more mass on land than in all the oceans combined, which relates very strongly to the fact that we were talking about mostly plants. Within those plants, it's mostly trees. Algae are dispersed and only a small fraction. So really, it's mostly plants, and plants are mostly terrestrial. The kelp forest and other things are just a minute contribution at the global perspective. You can then ask about this very fundamental thing that I know, at least back home in Israel, they teach it, I think, in junior high school, which is like things about consumers and producers. There's this trophic pyramids or food pyramids, where there's this rule of thumb about the value of, let's say, 10 to 1 from producers to the next trophic level that feeds on them, etc. And this is like a textbook material. And so we said, hey, we could try and look at it quantitatively. And we saw that in terms of producers on land, we really have, way more than consumers in all the trophic levels. But then when we looked at the marine environment, we actually seen the reverse picture, such that there's more mass in the consumers than in all the producers combined. It, of course, made us scratch our head, and you could try to think about all sorts of hypotheses. But what we think is happening here is a question of turnover. So if you look at what happens in the marine environment, the producers, usually plankton, they turn over very rapidly, usually on the order of days or a week. Usually either they, viruses attack them, or all sorts of zooplankton eats them, etc. Whereas the thing that feed on them, fish and some of the zooplankton, they live for much more extended periods of time, on the order of a year. So that means that even though there's a flux that is higher for the producers, which is, that's based on the rules of thermodynamics, of mass conservation, it couldn't be any other way. In terms of what is being accumulated as inventory over time, because it's accumulated over a much longer period of time, you have, as a result, this inverted food pyramid. So really, if you look in terms of productivity, the fluxes, as you can see on the left, that's really intact. But what you see on the right, in the oceans, it's really, at least globally, it is actually a reverse pyramid. So I want to go back to us, humanity, and in this big picture. So we talked about plants and bacteria, and humans make up about 0.01% of that total biomass, which begs the question, what is our effect on those other parts of the biosphere? So these are the sort of things that we're trying to do, both on wild mammals and the arthropods, etc. But let me give you a concrete question. If we look at mammals, which is something which is usually close to our heart. So mammals, what weighs more, the domesticated mammals versus the wild mammals? So we did that, and the picture, and we basically wanted to have a holistic view of mammals on Earth in terms of mass. And this is the resulting picture, where you can see in this depiction really the number of megatons of humans, of domesticated animals, of wild terrestrial mammals, and of wild marine mammals. And you can see a huge contrast here, such that the mass of domesticated mammals is 10 times more than all the wild land and marine mammals combined, which I think shows you something about the dominance of humanity now in many of the aspects of the biosphere. If you're interested in what happens exactly in the wild terrestrial and wild marine, so we've been looking at that. So here you can see a breakdown of really what are the components that make up each of those groups. But overall, there is more part of the big picture. So really, I have, I'm often reading bedtime stories to my daughters. And then in those stories, very often you have mammals that, quite prominently, something about, an elephant meeting a tiger, and then they have a wolf and they're talking. But actually, as a good scientist, if I want to tell them the realistic story of 2022, it would be something about the cow that meets another cow. They're going to a party of cows and they're meeting a sheep on the way. That would be a more realistic story in terms of, if you take a perspective in terms of mass. Getting at this analysis, we were able to get this overall census of the biomass on Earth. And you could also talk about what happens during time. And there's all sorts of changes due to deforestation, but also based on afforestation. But altogether, you have something that is relatively constant in time, going up and down. At the same time, you could ask what happens about human-made mass. Human-made mass, well, that would be not only your cell phones and cars, it would also be everything you make from cement or from aluminum, etc. And this, as you can imagine, is something that's rapidly rising, which brought us to the question when you have, I was taught in math, that when you have a graph that, is relatively constant as a function of time and something that's rapidly growing, at some point they're supposed to intersect. And we were asking ourselves the question, when is that intersection point supposed to happen? And as was mentioned in the introduction, when doing this analysis, and you can see it here, we found that as a function of time, in green, you can see the overall biomass, and all the other colors, you can see the different components made of concrete and aggregates and bricks and asphalt. And you can see that around the year 2020, these two values were the same, meaning that now 2022, the best estimates that we have are that now we have more human-produced mass, or what's known as anthropomass, than all the living things combined in terms of mass, or at least this is in dry weight. If you do it in wet weight, it's actually a few years difference. You can see it also depicted here. When you look, for example, at the top, there's actually more mass in plastics produced by humanity than all the mass of animals, or all the mass in buildings and infrastructure than all the mass of trees and shrubs. Now you can ask, why is this important? So, we went after this study because, we have the freedom to try and explore, but I think it also relates very much to some deep issues. And I think you can think about it in the following way. There's actually two competing narratives about the situation of the biosphere and the interaction between humanity and nature. In one, nature is just this immensely powerful thing where clearly nature is much stronger than any person or humanity. The way that we're affecting nature is something local, but the world is just, huge beyond comprehension. And also nature is rich, as we could see in many of the documentaries or going to your natural history museum. And one thing that's sort of like a corollary that comes out of this narrative is that nature does not require that much protection. It's so much stronger than we are. It's clear to me, by the way, that most of the people in the audience would not connect with that, but I think in the public eye, sometimes in the policy making, etc., I think that narrative is a big part of how people, think, and I think it has many deep roots also. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, so you could see the Iguazu Falls as an example of that. On the right-hand side, you can see another narrative talking about the fragile nature. What you can see here is the Dead Sea, which is falling because of water deprivation. And then nature is weak and requires protection, etc. And obviously, these two narratives, like many these polarizing views, that's never you have, when you put this polarization, none is fully true. Reality is way more complicated, much more multidimensional. It's way more more involved. But I think there's something that should be said here. This thing of like understanding, the world or nature, it really is beyond the comprehension when you try to, because there's so much of it. And I think numbers give you a very potent tool in order to look at that and to give you context. And in order to do that, I think humanity and its products are something very familiar to us, and therefore could serve as a benchmark to compare things. And when trying to do that analysis, mass is really something that makes comparison something that's defendable, rigorous, maybe even moving. For example, this comparison between the mass of domestic mammals versus wild mammals, you can do that comparison on a mass basis, and I think it has all sorts of meanings involved in that. So it does enable you to compare apples and oranges, something that would not be very easy in other ways. It's also a proxy for all sorts of ecosystem services, energy and material demands, etc. And it has advantages over trying to do things like comparing number of individuals or number of species, because it enables you to put, it's not really clear how many species, if we already have 1 million species and there are more, then why care about a few other species? Or maybe that's enough. And you can't say something about how many species you have per person on Earth. That seems nonsensical. But if you know that there's about 3 kilograms of wild mammals left on the planet for every person, I think that's could serve as something that would help us understand the situation in the current era of the Anthropocene. So with that, I think I covered much of what I wanted to tell you about our analysis of the biomass distribution on Earth, and I'll be happy to hear any questions, thoughts. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions for Ron? It's great to see some faces.
I have a quick question. This is Zan Schulten. Hi, Ron. I've always admired your work on systems biology, and you just went up several orders of magnitude in your presentation. So one thing, and particularly trying to also put the energy aspect of it together, we know that each of those, participants in the biomass have a different uptake, right? And how does that enter into your overall, I can see where you can do the weight, but then it's like, how does that enter in also to the energy analysis that you do?
Yes, so really in many cases we'll also be interested like in the flux or the flow, that for that you'll need to know the turnover. And the problem is that we don't have that information in anywhere near a global coverage as we could currently infer for the biomass. But if anybody, I think this, what we've been doing is a step in that direction, which really is related to giving us all sorts of insight. So I think once we'll, as a community, we'll be also making progress in that direction. I think it would be useful for us to get the energy flow in that respect. So the short answer is we don't have it, and I'll be happy to, we're trying to contribute our part in going in that direction.
Oh, no, I mean, I think there's not a one among us who has not used some data that you have touched, right? So, just a further comment, because I think when you start doing that turnover and the energy uptake and what it secretes, then you can really start giving an analysis of, like with the man-made stuff, how much of the energy it is taking, and we get so little back from it, even when we try to decompose it. So I think looking at it in these very high-level terms may give us insight how to handle universally garbage, right? Okay, thank you again. Lovely talk.
Good to see you.
Evan?
Hi, Ron. Evan DeLucia here. Thanks for the great talk. So for years, ecologists have touted this 10% law, 10% transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next. And your results suggest that it should be like the 0.01% law. How did we get these transfer efficiencies so wrong in the ecological community?
No, so I think that value refers to the flux of energy, and I think I don't think it's so wrong. It's definitely, I think 10% is a nice round number. So I also believe in using round numbers, and that's, I think, roughly right in many cases.
Okay, good. Thank you.
But what does not turn out is that, like, the view of thinking that in terms of inventory, you'll have the same ratios as the flux of energy and the efficiency. That's what we're showing, that at least in the oceans, because the turnover times are so different, then you don't have the same kind of pyramid that is being inferred from the 10%. But the 10% really talks about the energy content and fluxes. So that's where the difference arises.
And if I could just sneak in one more, the total carbon content in the oceans is north of 30 gigatons, but you had more biomass on land, so I'm assuming that's because that's all the vast majority is inorganic in the oceans. Is that correct?
Exactly so.
Yep.
Exactly so. So clearly, you're definitely right. The total inventory of carbon, on Earth is, orders of magnitude higher,
In the
both
ocean.
in the ocean and in, land sediments. So there's way more.
Yeah.
But this is something that turns over on a very, very different time scale. It's not living, and also is, in terms of like other effects, like say what you study in the IPCC, etc. It has a different reactivity and different relevance. So I think it's important to know this and important to know that. Thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you.
Don?
Hey, Ron, Don Ort. And so I was curious about your, terrestrial biosphere inventory, and, what does alive mean? And so, if we take a tree, most of the heartwood is, not technically alive. It's not respiring. And so the point I'm getting at, if there's 450 gigatons, and much of that is not really alive, does that in any way impact the implications or the conclusions that you would make from, for instance, the imbalance of the organic carbon on Earth versus the organic carbon in the ocean?
Yes, so that's definitely a valid point. We do give values in the supplementary material when we're also talking about, like, if you remove the hardwood and the like bark, and still if you just account for only the leaves, you would still get more. So I was talking about an 80-fold larger biomass on land than in the oceans. So even if you remove, I don't know, 2/3, because this is in the bark, or even a bit more than that, you're still getting a very large dominance for the terrestrial systems.
Andrew?
Hi there. Thank you very much for a great talk. I really enjoyed that. I apologize if I missed this because my internet cut out early on, but I was interested in, you described your methodology as looking at environmental gradients, how they drive biomass, and then building the model from there. I was wondering which environmental factors dominate that variation in biomass across the planet, and how do you deal with the way their effects combine? Do you assume that they're additive, or do you account for interactions amongst them?
Yes, so one of the challenges in this work is that you need to use different environmental parameters for different taxa, because the type of information that we have, but also the type of factors that influence the propensity or the bio is different among the. So of course, what's true for fish is not what's true for trees, right? And so it's a very diverse number of methodologies and approaches. And it's like kind of like a meta analysis. So it's not like we did everything from scratch, right? We didn't measure those things, but in many cases we even didn't do the collection or the combining of the data, because there's many previous studies and reviews and other things that. So now it's kind of like a puzzle of different components. So I can't give you a simple answer, but I can direct you to the supplementary material of this PNAS paper, which is 100 pages, filled with all the, for every different taxa, how exactly do you do that? And just to make it such that it's clear to us that this could also be improved, for each such thing, we put as a Jupyter notebook, something that an easy electronic version for editing and updating, such that when more data is available, or if somebody has different approaches, or we didn't use additive models, it's also different statistical models involved, but they don't have to be additive. But if somebody has a more fancy way, or they're doing this machine learning, deep whatever, they're welcome to try and, they have all the data there, they could just run the code again with some better ways, and we could just, try to improve it with time. Because this census of life, it clearly should, by itself evolve and update. But I have to say, I was quite stunned. So this whole thing started actually not because we were, we were after a different question. We had this, we were working on Rubisco, the enzyme Rubisco, and in general carbon fixation, which is the other thing my lab does, and maybe one other day we could talk about it. And then there's this claim that Rubisco is the most abundant protein on Earth. So we became curious, is that true? So we said, okay, we need to look at other enzymes or other proteins. And for that, the student was working on that. I told him, for that, we first of all, let's look. So it's different in bacteria than in plants. So I told him, you just go to Encyclopedia Britannica. It was, way back, or something else, and just get the values. And from there we could, but then he couldn't find anything of that sort. So he said, there's something strange here. And for quite a while, we were working on it and still thinking that we'll find out it exists somewhere. And then it turned out there's no such holistic picture. And that's how this study came out to be.
Cool, thank you very much.
Ron, just on a kind of practical note, you obviously from your analysis, because trees are the bulk of biomass on the planet. I guess one of the difficulties we always have with, working out amounts of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems is what's below ground, particularly the massive roots. And I wondered how you tackled that.
Yeah, so here we relied really on other people that, this question has been on people's mind, for a long time. And there's all sorts of ways that you probably know of, like how, you take out a tree and you find ways in order to see exactly what is the roots and then the fine roots, etc. I think the rule of thumb that I don't remember, like we used what is known in the literature as kind of like, I don't remember if it was a general consensus or it's actually a biome dependent and it's different for trees and for shrubs, etc. But I think it's some, the below ground is something like a third or something along those lines in terms of the overall biomass. And then from that, you can infer further.
Okay, yeah. So I wonder, is the next step to then try and get turnover in these systems?
So there's quite a few next steps possible here, and we're trying to take a few of them. The issue of going to finding turnover and from there inferring the flows of energy and material and fluxes is, I think, very important. It's a tough one, at least for us. So I hope others would help tackle that, because I think and also that there'll be new methodologies that could facilitate that.
Yeah, I mean the International Biological Program of maybe half a century ago did try to do that. Obviously wasn't quite successful, but there's probably a lot of buried data there that could start to inform today. Yeah.
Yes, so we, in our looking for all of those resources and looking at this meta-analysis and other things, we definitely actually built upon things that were started at this IBP effort from decades ago. I would say that, I would think that, it would be good to come back to it with new technologies. I think the time is ripe, especially before we lose much more of the biosphere, that, that we use all the different tools in order to give us this more accurate, holistic picture. And I think given that today we know, in many countries, we know every person, and I don't know, Facebook and other things have so much information on each one of them. I think, it's time that we have something equivalent for nature and that would inform understanding, policy making, heritage, many other things, education.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point.
I have a really quick question. I'm sorry. My voice is gone due to COVID. But anyway, so it was really interesting graph that the non-living mass is now crossing the biomass. When you're calculating the biomass, are you only considering the carbon or a related mass, not the amount of hydration, for instance, water contents?
No, so that is thanks for asking. This is being done not only for carbon. So what I've shown you, the graph that I've shown you, is for the dry weight, including, everything. And there's also, if you look at the paper itself, it's in the paper itself, also the wet mass, then the year of intersection moves by a few years. But because we're doubling the anthropomass if I'm not mistaken, every 20 years, or even 15 years, something like that. So it means that actually this is rapidly. So even if you have a factor of 2, it's just a difference of a decade and a half.
I see. Another question is, can you do this analysis to see how the composition of the biomass change over time? You had this very big mass in plants, but in a bigger time scale, is there any way to look at how these relative distribution among different species has evolved in different era and stuff?
So we're very curious about it. It's also a tough question. I could say that there are estimates. If you look at the overall biomass, there are some estimates that it was about double before humanity became so dominant. So basically, in our in turning forests into agriculture land and also some grasslands into agriculture, we basically decrease the mass of plants and therefore the mass of the overall mass biomass in the biosphere by a factor of 2. So it used to be about twice. So that's from the group of Karl-Heinz in Vienna. If you look at the other groups, it's even tougher to do that, but we are trying to do things more specifically focused on, say, mammals or fish or birds. So I'll be happy, we're sharing whatever we come up with as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Hi, Ron. Thanks. Great talk. It's a kind of a similar question. I was kind of leading on from that. It is interesting to see what you can start doing when you predict trends and things like this. I was wondering if you can comment if there's any insight that can be gained from this about what, in terms of if we think about how to reduce a continual damage or footprint to the earth, what areas would be biggest to try to focus on in terms of trying to combat environmental degradation or things like this?
Yes, so there's many dimensions that are involved in this, in this question and in our impact. I think not necessarily from this study, but from many different angles, we know that things that are very have very big effects relates what kind of all the construction in terms of what kind of buildings we're building, how big they are, how green they are. So that's one. So buildings and infrastructure, that's one big thing. Transportation in all its forms has a big impact, and diet is and food consumption, agriculture, etc., is also has a lot of environmental impacts. So these are like three big big aspects. Obviously, I'm not suggesting, like it would be very difficult to, say, to reverse this picture altogether. And I'm enjoying the fact that I have a house to live in and I have a car, and I wouldn't want it to be otherwise. At the same time, I hope that, being more aware of this, I think creates a situation where I think we understand we have more responsibility, and we have to, think about, the policy making, how much are we consuming, how are we consuming, because I think we can't hide anymore behind the thought that, the world is just infinite and we're just, one species and, among so many, and therefore our impacts are tiny. I think that's untenable. And I think this work shows it in another way, in a pretty rigorous manner.
I guess one last big question, Ron. If we're thinking, at least 1 billion more people added to the planet, within maybe the next 20, 25 years, that suddenly the global trend we're seeing is per capita demand for food is increasing yet further. So UNFAO say possibly we need to be producing 50% more by 2050. From all your analyses, are there a couple of big things you can see that would, make a difference, prevent us destroying yet more of the biosphere?
Yes, so that's again, a very big picture. So, we just talked about, say 3 things that I think would have a very big impact, like, how we constructing, buildings and infrastructure, the way and the amount of transport and how it's being done, and the kind of food that we're consuming, and their amounts. And all of that, I don't think we should think about this again in a polarizing or an extreme manner. Like there's no way that, like, that we, that the environment would stay completely untouched or we won't have any effects. But then anything that we do to, to put things more in balance, or to consume less, or to think more, about how to have better technologies in order to how to produce our food or how to transport ourselves, would make things better. So I think it all lives on a continuum, and you don't have to think in just, black and white picture, but you can just understand that, the better we'll do it, things would still be on a continuum better.
Okay, thanks. If there are no further questions, then I'll ask you to join me in thanking Ron for an amazing seminar and an amazing analysis. So and also, showing, what you can actually do with big data and how insightful that can be. I mean, your example to all of us, Ron, on doing this. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us and being one of our Pioneers awardees. So thank you. And please, everyone, join me in thanking Ron, either with a virtual clap or with an actual clap. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. All the best to all.
Yeah, and you're meeting with some of us tomorrow, so look forward to that, and we'll let you get your sleep.
Okay, I hope to see some of you at the Weizmann Institute one day.
Yep. Well, I've been there twice. We're waiting for you to come to Illinois.
That's fair.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.